The Liberation of Sundrian City by Andrew Lewis. Chapter 15. Saturation. Linus took a seat in the dining hall, a glass of cold water before him but no food, and waited for Commander Deimos. He had carefully chosen a seat at the far end of the hall, with a view of the entrance and plenty of room between him and it, for this would allow him the maximum amount of time to explain himself before the commander reached him. He knew that Deimos wasn't fond of him, and wasn't at all happy to have him in the palace. This much was clear from the start. Furthermore, he knew that Deimos would punish his staff severely for any tardiness, and Linus had been a no-show. He'd been entirely absent, with no excuse, and on his very first day, he knew he was in trouble. And so he sat and waited, remembering Remy's slurred words about Deimos making an example of him, and wondering what exactly that might have meant. He took only small sips of water for fear of having a full mouth when Commander Deimos entered. He would have limited time to make his case, and he didn't want his voice hindered in any way. His heart beat unevenly, and his mind raced. Some of the nearby guards looked sideways at him, and whispered and pointed subtly, perhaps trying to work out why there was a 13-year-old boy amongst them. But Linus took little notice of them, for he was busy trying to script in his mind exactly what he would say to Deimos when he arrived, but to little avail. All he could think to do was blurt out, "I was with Emperor Frigg." And then it happened. Commander Deimos exploded through the entrance, and the chatter of the room instantly died out to become silence, but for a few scraping chairs and whispers and gasps. Deimos was visibly furious, his presence enveloping the entire room at once. It had been scarcely a second before his eyes had locked onto Linus, and he came powerfully through the room at full stride. Linus's face blanched. His heart stopped and his vision dimmed, and he saw nothing but Deimos coming ever closer, and terror exploded in his chest, and he slid backward in his chair. His plan to explain himself entirely by the time Deimos reached him had utterly failed. For as the commander threw the table aside, sending its contents flying, wrenched him from his seat by the collar and slammed him hard against the wall, Linus was still yet to mutter a single word. The guards sitting adjacent to Linus had slid edgeways to give the scene some space, and they too gaped wordlessly at Deimos, barely daring to breathe. "You missed assembly," Deimos snarled. Whack. Something hard collided with Linus's head. He would have dropped to the ground if he weren't held so tight to the wall. "We do not tolerate indolence here, Smith." Another blow, deep into the stomach. This time Linus was allowed to drop to the floor, where he curled into a ball, coughing and groaning. He had never known such solid blows. It was like being beaten by an ogre. He was utterly winded, and for a second he thought back to his father's beatings almost longingly. "Up," said Deimos, a command. Linus rolled about, trying to find his breath. He whimpered. "Get up, Smith, now," Deimos utterly exploded. Tears welled in his eyes, and he drew himself wearily to his feet, still sobbing. "You will not miss an assembly again, will you, boy? I'm sorry." "Will you?" "No, sir." Deimos shoved Linus back to arm's length and then delivered a heavy strike directly to Linus's cheek. It felt like iron colliding with flesh, and Linus fell to the floor once more. Deimos strode away toward the dining hall's exit. "Half an hour, the elephant training reserve, be there or else," he said curtly, without turning, and then he was gone. "I was with Franklin," Linus muttered to nobody at all. For the next little while, Linus sat in the hall with a glass of chilled water against his cheek and his head spinning. He was in a great deal of pain and wanted nothing more than to lie down for a few hours, but he couldn't. Someone had picked him up off the ground and now sat beside him at the table. Linus asked in a dazed and slurred speech how to get to the elephant training reserve, and the man had told him he was going there too and would take him. This brought some relief, He could put that worry out of his mind and focus on getting his head straight. The man stood. "Wait here," he said, and wandered off toward the buffet. When he returned, he thrust a deep goblet of wine before Linus, who groaned and slid it away in disgust. "It will help ease the pain, for now anyway," he suggested. Figuring it couldn't make his head much worse, and feeling briefly reckless, he took the wine and gulped it down in one hit. His eyes watered and burned, and the liquid seemed to squirt back up his throat as he swallowed. Linus, still relatively new to the business of drinking wine, was yet to find an appreciation for the taste. Furthermore, the wine served in the guard's dining hall was utter trash compared to the Valentos he had been drinking of recent times. "One more, please," he moaned. And when he looked, he noticed that the man he spoke to seemed rather too old to be a guard. The helpful man obliged, and when Linus had downed both the wine and the water, they left the dining hall and made their way to the elephant training reserve. As they entered the grounds, the sun spiked Linus's eyes mercilessly. The man instructed him to wipe here and there, cleaning the blood off his face and chin and neck. Walking through the grounds, Linus recognized the glass house where he had spotted the princess and Goresh on that first night that he snuck into the gardens, and smelt the familiar cocktail of potent flowers. But they continued walking far past that until it was gone from view. The sun was out in full force, and the air was dry and hot, and Linus all but prayed for some mercy from the sun. His head was pounding agonizingly. By the time they reached the elephant training reserve, which was in the far back corner of the palace gardens, just beyond a small lake that Linus never knew existed, he was looking almost as new again, if you ignored the large red bruise blossoming on his cheek and the swelling in the corner of his bloodied lip. The training reserve was little more than a stretch of land covered only partially in patchy dried grass, which grew upon dusty flattened earth. Scattered around the training reserve were wooden pegs and stumps, logs, sandbags the size of and shape of humans, and of course elephants standing lazily about. Deimos could be seen attending to Mott, his favourite elephant, and a few other guards lingered around. "You're early," said the helpful man, whose name Linus had learnt was Elman. He was long-limbed and rather spry for an older fellow, with a thin veil of wispy grey hair atop a kind and furrowed face, and Linus had learnt that he was not a guard after all, but was responsible for maintaining the elephants and their living space. "Probably a good thing," said Linus, who was staring, already lost in awe, at the magnificent creatures before him. He spotted the clumsy elephant that he had used to crush Cressini, and without thinking wandered over to it to say hello. He reached out and stroked the trunk, and the elephant sniffed Linus around his feet for recognition and greeted him with flapping ears and a friendly trumpet. It dipped its head low enough for him to touch its forehead, and then uncurled its trunk as an offer to Linus, who accepted and placed his foot on it. He reached up and grabbed the stem of an ear and hoisted himself up and over the head of the beast and sat bow-legged across the neck. The two of them trundled about the reserve, Linus giving no orders at all, instead allowing the elephant to take him around at its own accord. It took him to show off the logs, placing a foot on one and rolling it back and forth. Then it wandered towards the lake, weaving between some yellow pegs in the earth along the way, as if to show Linus how, and finally, at the lake's edge, it dipped its trunk into the water and sprayed it high into the air, soaking a giggling Linus to the core. Commander Deimos called for order, and the elephant walked back and delivered Linus to the edge of the group of 4 guards assembled in front of him. The commander stood stock still with his hands tucked behind his back while Linus dismounted and the elephant wandered away. He half expected Deimos to reprimand him for mounting the elephant without being ordered to do so, but was surprised to see that he wasn't at all concerned over the matter. Elman wasn't among the group, and Linus wondered where he might have gone. But he didn't wander long, for at the end of the field, set against the sheer rock face of the mountain, he spotted something that appeared to be similar to a horse stable, only much larger so as to accommodate elephants, and he supposed that Elman might have gone into it to fulfill his duties. "Riders, standard training drills today, nothing special. Let's start with 3 laps of the circuit. I'm taking Mott. I'll let you sort out amongst yourselves which elephants you take." Some of the men glanced around the field to spot their preferred beasts. "Oh, except you, Smith. You ought to take Missy over there." Deimos pointed to an elephant at the far end of the field, and the other 4 riders sniggered amongst themselves. It was a huge creature, make no mistake, but as far as war elephants go, it was tiny. The smallest of the lot by far, it stood restless, swaying side to side, its trunk springing about happily, and its ears flapping. It seemed to be smiling. It also seemed to be far more energetic than any of the others. So, thought Linus, Deimos had assigned him the smallest elephant. Well, the joke was on him because he didn't mind one bit, and with a shrug of indifference he nodded agreement and smiled to Deimos, dried blood cracking on his lip. Strong hatred brewed in his heart as he looked at Deimos, but he didn't let it show. He acted as if the beating in the dining hall hadn't happened. He acted as if he couldn't remember the incident, although he could vividly. "Go now, get your elephants and assemble at the beginning of the course," said Deimos, turning to make toward Mott, who stood looming in the shade of a large evergreen tree. Linus did so. As he approached Missy, the first thing he noticed was, to his surprise, that Missy was evidently a male. A small though fully grown young male, teeming with youthful energy. Missy saw Linus approaching and began to sway and tread on the spot in anticipation. His trunk shot out to greet and sniff him and just about bowled him over, colliding hard with his shoulder. "Easy, Missy, easy now," he said as soothingly as he could. It had little effect. The elephant was excited like a child with a play date. When Linus attempted to bow the animal's head to mount over the trunk, he quickly realized that Missy was not obedient enough for this rather tricky style of mounting. Each time he got a foot on the trunk, it would sway around uncontrollably, making it impossible for Linus to keep his balance. He changed his tack and mounted from the side using the harness grips and footholds, though even this proved difficult as Missy began to trot about when Linus was only midway up. A short struggle later, once firmly positioned on Missy's neck, Linus instructed him sternly to stand still. The elephant obeyed and stood on the spot, although somewhat restlessly, still swaying about side to side. From here, Linus could see the other guards sniggering at him from atop their beasts. They had already assembled before Deimos, who sat atop the towering mass that was Mott. He wore an expression that was equal parts impatience, anger, and suppressed amusement at Linus's struggles. Linus gave the instruction to move forward, and the beast jolted forward in what seemed like the very same instant and moved straight past trotting into a full-blown sprint. Linus tried frantically to slow the beast, screaming commands and pulling ears and clenching his thighs, but the beast barreled on, gaining speed as it approached the group. At the very last moment before collision, Missy swung and stumbled to a halt, his rear end colliding heavily with the rear end of another elephant. Linus all but fell to the ground, sliding off but gripping hard to the harness. He pulled himself back up on top of the elephant to the laughter of the group. "The great Linus Smith, gentlemen," said Commander Deimos smugly. More laughter. "Linus, you disappoint me. And to think we had such high hopes. Emperor Frigg had such high hopes. Looks like you aren't the prodigy that we thought you were." Linus was too angry and embarrassed to respond, so he busied himself with repeating the command to stand still over and over, which was entirely necessary in order to stop Missy from prancing about. It was becoming increasingly clear to Linus that the joke that was currently on him went beyond merely giving him the smallest animal. Deimos had given him an overexcited elephant that wasn't fully trained. "I'll proceed first, follow my lead, one at a time, one course step behind me," said Deimos to the group, taking the attention off Linus somewhat mercifully. The sun, however, was not so merciful. It beamed strong and relentless, as if to antagonize Linus further.